This is the Ancient and Medieval History lesson for Friday, the 22nd of April, 2022. Remember, you are to watch this in its entirety, see anything associated I send, and make it a unique, worthwhile, thoughtful, paragraph-length comment in the public comment section right where this thing is posted on Google Classroom. So, we have been talking about Charlemagne, and the thing that you really need to understand about him before we move on to his successors, the trajectory of Roman and later Western history in terms of hope versus despair has been on a downward spiral since the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD. After that, you have what leads to the crisis of the 3rd century, and then the rise of Diocletian and the harsh dominate, and the Christian Empire after Constantine the Great, and it's just holding on, desperately holding on to what they have. And then finally the West falls. And you have the barbarian kingdoms in the Dark Ages in Western Europe. And for hundreds of years, the people of Europe are living in the increasingly grand-seeming, mysterious shadows of the ruins of the ancient civilization of Rome. A civilization that could build buildings 5 stories and more, a civilization that could build roads from horizon to horizon, a civilization that could build aqueducts and bridges, cities so full of stone that for hundreds of years they were used as the rock quarries of their descendants. We are a fallen people, many in Western Europe believed. We did something wrong. Our ancestors did. Maybe they were proud. And doom came to them. And the world emptied of people. We cling and cleave in hope that God will save us. Well, there's nothing despairing about that. Hoping for divine intervention is something that people of all faiths often do. What is sad, depressing, despair-oriented is the sense of hopelessness and inferiority that the medieval Westerners had during the Dark Ages towards the builders of those ancient ruins. What giants, what demigods, what heroic beings must have walked the world in those days, those amazing days of yore. Charlemagne's accession to the Western Roman Imperium by his ally the Pope, whom he had just saved from the Lombards, creates in Europe a new hope, a new spirit of possibility that we can make a world as good as or better than the world that those ancestors made. We at least might be able to aspire to compete with them at some point. Charlemagne conquers an empire from the Pyrenees to the Elbe River in Germany. He has the heart of what will be the modern lands of France, Northern Italy, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Belgium, Holland, Western Germany. That is the heart of the West. He has influence in England, but he doesn't rule it. He has an ongoing war, hot or cold, with the Moors of Spain. He conquers the Saxons and overawes the Germans to the east. Charlemagne achieves peace and prosperity. He builds a canal between the Upper Rhine and Upper Danube to stimulate trade. He encourages the preservation of books, which arrests the ongoing hemorrhage of knowledge as books are just ruined and wasted? Well, Charlemagne backs up the monks with royal power and royal money. He helps turn what was an ever-reducing number of books that end up being smaller than any typical high school library's collection of titles, stabilizes and begins to actually grow that number of book titles back. He even himself learns to read as an adult and write. It's always a struggle for him. He doesn't learn this until he's an adult, and he's learning it in Latin rather than the Frankish language that he knows, because that's what he speaks. Charlemagne's advisor is Alcuin of York. The Song of Roland tells the story of one of Charlemagne's paladins fighting a desperate rearguard action against the Moors who are trying to pursue across the Pyrenees from Spain. And he builds what is, for Western Europe, amazing buildings at Aix-la-Chapelle, which is today the city of Aachen in the Rhineland in Western Germany. Hope is not something that is to be underestimated. Hope is what gives people the courage to dream big dreams and put themselves at risk, discomfort themselves, exert themselves in hopes of making something splendid, better for the future. In hope of making a better future. Without hope, people crawl up and die. They may not do that physically, but they do it in terms of their ambition and their spirit. Now, after Charlemagne dies, his empire is eventually divided among his grandchildren. This division is threefold, is tripartite. The division of the empire in three happens roughly along these lines. So here is the Carolingian Empire. That's what Charlemagne's empire is called. Border with Muslim Spain. The English Channel and the Atlantic Ocean are borders. The Elbe River is roughly a border in Saxony and the area east of the Alps and southern Italy. So, the empire is primarily divided in three. So, you've got the west, the middle, and the east. Now, the middle is originally named after Lothar, grandson of Charlemagne. And it's called Lotharingia. Obviously, the area to the west is Proto-France, and the area to the east is Proto-Germany, what will become eventually France and Germany. The center eventually becomes Burgundy. And Burgundy is going to be the origin of the Habsburgs that are going to end up being so important in the late Middle Ages and early modern times, up through World War I, really. And it's the origin point of the modern nations of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Holland. Now, all of these territories are eventually, over the next 500 or more years, going to shift a bit eastward. Germany will shift eastward in what's called the Drang nach Osten. I don't speak German, should be obvious. Burgundy shifts a little bit eastward, and France is going to shift eastward too. But that takes centuries of time. Better part of half a thousand years, half a millennium. The origins of the modern nations of Western Europe, including Italy, are forged in the Carolingian or Charlemagne's empire. And the hope that is going to make it possible for people to build a new world is also forged by that man at that time. Now, we are going to shift gears from studying broadly about Western Europe to studying specifically about the island of Britain and what will become the Kingdom of England. And the reason we do this, to conclude our period of Dark Age study, is we in the United States are descendant from England. Our cultural ancestry does include influences from all over the world. China, Japan, India, Africa, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Southern Europe, Central Europe, Northern Europe, Latin America, the Pacific Islands, Australia even. But we are part of Western civilization, which comes out of this Christendom of early medieval Europe, the Dark Ages. And the American Republic was based on the 13 colonies of British North America. English society and culture is the basis for American. That's one of the reasons why we speak this tongue of English. So, we're going to learn about how England comes to be through the Dark Ages. We start with from Roman Britain to Norman England. Now, the earliest residents of the British Isles that we know about, the builders of the Ogham stones and many of the standing stones, particularly Stonehenge, are not Celts. They are not Britons. They are not Gauls. They are not Druid-worshipping people. Those come in the first millennium before Christ. Stonehenge was built before that. Do we know who these early residents of the British Isles were? No, not really. We have some archaeological information, but we really don't have much cultural information. By the time historical records are kept by the Romans, who moved for the first time into that part of Europe, the Celts, the Gauls in France and the Britons in Britain, have been there for as long as anyone can remember. So, the Celts who occupy Britain when Caesar conquers the Gauls are of a similar culture. The men tend to have long mustaches, short beards, if any. They tend to wear tartan plaids. They tend to use chariots in warfare. The women are allowed to own property as well as the men. They have a lot more scope and freedom than women often do in the Mediterranean world. The physiognomy tends towards creamy skin, freckled skin, red hair, green eyes. They're the ancestors of the Irish, the Welsh, Scots, and all sorts of other people. Del, I'm doing a video lecture, so let's pass for today, okay? Thank you. So, in fact, what we have in Britain are people who are allied with the Gauls that Caesar's fighting. And the first Roman incursion in Britain occurs under Gaius Julius Caesar. He goes to Britain like he goes to Germany, to show the flag, smack people around, and let people know without doubt, don't mess with Rome. And the Britons learn this lesson to a great degree. About a century later, the Emperor Claudius orders the conquest of Britain with several legions. And the area of southeastern Britain, what we would today call southern England, is conquered by Rome. Now, Rome will never dominate more than the southern half to two-thirds of the island of Britain. It'll send expeditions north of that, but the British Isles are vast. The island of Britain itself is the size of Idaho, but it's got countless thousands of little offshore islets and islands. And to the west of Britain is the Isle of Man and the island of Ireland, and to the north is this massive Scottish region. It's just it is its own little microcosmic world. And the Romans never make a commitment to rule that much of the world, of that British world. Still, the Celts are conquered. Queen Boadicea, a generation after, well, I'll do this properly. In Claudius's time, the chief of the Celts, the Britons, is a chieftain named Caractacus. And Caractacus is conquered and brought to Roman chains, and southern England is taken. And then, like with Arminius and the Germans, a generation of captives are brought to Rome to learn some civilized ways. And these captives bring knowledge back to a Celtic chieftain named Boudicca. Boudicca is a queen, not a king. She's a female ruler. And a generation or so after Claudius, Boudicca launches a rebellion against Rome that drives the Romans not out of Britain, but back. And it takes time for the Romans to conquer. After Boadicea, southern Britain and much of central Britain is going to remain pacified as part of the Roman world, and it will be Romanized through the planting of veteran colony cities and all the methods I talked about last unit. In fact, by the 4th century, by the 300s AD, the Britons have not only been reconciled to Roman rule, they have grown used to it, to depend upon it. And like the peaceful civilians of other parts of the empire, when the empire's grip on power begins to shake apart, the everyday people of Roman Britain have difficulty coming together, putting on armor, taking weapons into their hand, and fighting for their own independence. The Romans begin to pull out of Britain in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the late 300s and the early 400s. And by the early 400s, Britain is under attack by 3 groups of tribes from Denmark. Let me see if I can find a map of Britain here while I'm talking. It would be nice to be able to do that. I know it'll be an ancient map, but if I can get a good close-up map of the British Isles, gosh, that would be fun and nice and wonderful, which is probably why it won't happen, because why on earth these maps have what I want right now? Nope. Okay. Britain is under attack from the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes are coming from Denmark and from northwestern Germany. So, let's take another look over here. Not at me. Hello. Yes, I'm bald. I know it's a surprise to many of you, but it's true. You have to live with the reality of it. Okay. The Jutes come from Jutland. The Saxons come from Saxony. Well, not modern Saxony, but the Saxon lands of those times. And the Angles come from an area in between them. The Romans leave, and the Romans controlled things up to the Hadrian's Wall here, and for a while to the Antonine Wall here. But the area north of these walls remained wild, and Ireland was never even contemplated for conquest. So, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, in the late 3 and early 400s, begin to get into boats and launch attacks. Now, there's a legend, maybe more than a legend, that a local British king named Vortigern, has a problem with Pictish invasion. So he actually hires two brothers, Hengist and Horsa, who bring the first Anglo-Saxon warriors into Britain. And Hengist and Horsa fight the Picts, but eventually decide this land is going to be ours. And they begin to establish East Anglia and the land of the South Saxons and the land of a bunch of Anglo-Saxon lands in eastern and southern England, what we now call England. The Britons are fighting them, the Romanized Britons. And there's a story of a Romanized Briton king named Aurelianus Ambrosius, who is probably the basis of the King Arthur myth. He unifies a coalition of British tribes and orchestrates a defeat of the Anglo-Saxons at a place that we still haven't identified called Baden Hill. And at Baden Hill, or Mount Baden, the Saxons are checked for a generation. And again, this is the time of the mythical Knights of the Round Table. But whatever success Aurelianus Ambrosius or Arturius the Bear, King Arthur, whatever the Britons might have had in terms of success in the 500s AD, is going to fade as the Anglo-Saxons, probably should use a different color, are going to move farther west. Ultimately, the Anglo-Saxons are going to take territory in the east of Britain. And the west of Britain is still occupied by the Britons, the Celts, the former Romanized people. However, the Anglo-Saxons are not reconciled to just control the lands that they have. So they keep moving westward generation by generation. And ultimately they cut Cornwall off from Wales, off from Strathclyde, and ultimately the Anglo-Saxons take Celtic Cornwall. A number of British Celts go to French Brittany and establish a Celtic society there. And Strathclyde is eventually conquered, and you have basically an England or Angloland that extends about 2/3 of the way up the island of Britain and includes the entire south except for Wales. At first, the Anglo-Saxons are pagans. But then, a St. Augustine, not of Hippo Regius, not the St. Augustine who wrote the City of God, but a St. Augustine who will later be known as Augustine of Canterbury, is sent by Rome to convert the Anglo-Saxon pagans to Christianity, to change their worship from Wotan, which is the Anglo-Saxon Odin, to God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. There are stories about the arrival of the Augustinian mission. Oftentimes, pagans are met with what's called a great shout. If you've ever played the Elder Scrolls Skyrim, you know that shouts are a part of some of the legends of the North. Well, the Augustinian monks that land in southern England to try to convert the Saxons are occasionally said to have the power of shouting and stunning their enemies with a holy sound, like the trumpet of heaven. Now, the British Isles have been Christianized. The Roman Britons, for example, were Christians. And so the Welsh retained some of this. And some of the Christianity is then passed in the early Dark Ages from Britain to Ireland. Now we come to the story of St. Patrick. Patrick is a young Brit from Wales who is captured by Irish slavers who are raiding the western shores of Britain. He's brought to Ireland, and as a slave in Ireland, he learns their language, he learns their customs, he learns their culture, and he escapes back to Britain. And he then gets a vocation and has that vocation confirmed, at least as far as he believes. So he goes back to Ireland, not as a slave, but as the missionary of the Christian faith. There are many adventures that St. Patrick has. Legend has it that Patrick drives the snakes out of Ireland. Ireland does not have any native snake population. And the snakes are also a euphemism for pagans, in that Ireland is brought into the Christian faith because of Patrick. But the Christian faith of Patrick is not the Christian faith of Rome. It's separate. Roman Christianity tends to use the symbol of the crucifix, which is a cross that has a statue of Jesus hanging from it and suffering from it. Protestants today tend to use a plain cross. But the Celtic Church uses what's called Celtic Crosses. This is just a superficial difference. And a Celtic cross looks something like a better drawn version of this. What you have is a cross superimposed over the sun or over a circle. So a simpler version of that would be with a circle there. In any event, the Celtic Christians and the Roman Christians disagree on a few things, like when Easter is. So in the year 664, King Oswiu of the English kingdom of Northumbria, basically central Britain, calls to his great monastery on the eastern coast of the North Sea at Whitby a synod, a holy council, a church council. And in that council, representatives of Patrick's Irish Celtic Church and representatives of the Roman Catholic Church debate. And a decision is ultimately reached that Northumbria will become Roman Christian and not Celtic Christian. And this distinction between Roman Christian and Celtic Christian is going to be in play for the next few hundred years. Eventually, the Celtic Christian faith will be absorbed by the Roman Catholic Christian faith. But this is, Synod of Whitby is important. St. Patrick, Celtic Christians are important. I hope you get all that. Now, King Arthur's long gone. The English, who are now basically the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, the Germanic barbarians that took over, are now Christianized. They're now settled. They call the Britons, who used to occupy the land, Velas, W-A-E-L-A-S, which means foreigners, savages, wild men. And ultimately, they build a series of dikes. Offa, King Offa, particularly of Mercia, is known to build an earthenwork wall. Building a wall can work. To separate his lands from the raiding Velas, the raiding barbarian foreigners. And it's just interesting because the Romanized Britons had been civilized long before the Anglo-Saxons and had been Christian long before the Anglo-Saxons. But now the English people live in a very wealthy land. Series of kingdoms, actually. You've got Essex, the kingdom of the East Saxons. Sussex, the kingdom of the South Saxons. I suppose I should bring this closer. Okay. So here's the island of Britain. Essex, the kingdom of the East Saxons, which is basically northeast of London. Sussex, the kingdom of the South Saxons, which is basically south of London. Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, which includes south-central England and ultimately Cornwall. Mercia, which is the central kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. And Northumbria, which is the northern kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And they are part of the same culture, but they work at cross purposes and competition. At times, Mercia is strong and tries to conquer the others. Then Wessex gets strong. So this is a wealthy land, a divided land, and it's this land that the legend of Beowulf comes into. This is roughly from the 7th through the 9th centuries, from the 600s to the 800s. But late in the time of Charlemagne's reign, the first Northmen arrive. They are Danes from Denmark, and they are engaged in Viking. Viking means to raid. Now, we're going to talk a lot about the Vikings next week, but what you need to know now, let's get a nice new color here, is that the Danes, they had first come to raid. Then they land a grand army, a guy named Halfdan. And their grand army doesn't go home for the winter. A raider attacks, loots, does all the things that a raider does, rapes, burns, murders, whatever, steals. And then they go home for the winter to enjoy their booty, their loot, their treasure, their slaves. But when the grand army arrives of the Danes, when the invasion army arrives, when Halfdan arrives, they don't go home. They're here to stay. And ultimately, the Danes, I should do this in black because nothing else will work. Ultimately, the Danes are going to take Northumbria, and they're going to take Essex, and they're going to take Sussex, and they're going to take Mercia. And the only Anglo-Saxon kingdom that will stand against them is going to be Wessex, at least for a while. Now, what this does is it creates a tripartite division of Britain. The east is Danish. It's called the Danelaw. The west is Celtic. It's Wales, and before they're conquered, Cornwall and Strathclyde, and then in the north they're the Picts, and then conquered by the Irish, the Scots. The center, which I'm now going to erase to show you where it is the English lands between the Danelaw and the Celts. This area here, parts of Mercia and Wessex. So, where I am going to leave it for next week is Wessex is now alone. Mercia has fallen. Sussex and Essex long ago. Northumbria longest ago. Monasteries have been attacked. They were the first thing to be attacked. So when we come back on Monday, I am going to talk about the attacks on the monasteries, and then I'm going to shift about 100 years later to a time when the Danes are present and when Wessex is threatened, and the time of King Alfred, the only king in all of the history of England and Britain ever to be called the Great. Make a comment about this before 2 o'clock, Friday, the 22nd. Have a good weekend, and remember, Ancient History has the last chapter survey of the year, chapter survey 11, due Monday, and you'll have a Baker quiz on that. After that, except for incidental movie worksheets or anything else, and quizzes and tests, of course, and the final exam, the only written work you've got to do at home is the case study, which hopefully you are already working on. Have a good day.